Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to this lecture. Today's session is on the concept of competitiveness. We will see what competitiveness means, what are the basic dimensions of competitiveness, what does it mean at different levels, including us as individuals, what are the key drivers of this concept of competitiveness, what is its importance, and how do we go forward having understood this concept. Let me switch back to my desktop. As mentioned, this session is on the concept of competitiveness. My name is Dr. Sudhendar Hanumantharao. I am the Dean, Faculty of Management and Commerce at Manipal University in Jaipur. This program is being broadcast on Swayam Prabha channel 16. Moving forward, historically, especially as the field of management science has developed, there has always been a search for some measure, some metric to be able to compare two things and say object A is better than object B. What are the ways in which we could honestly say that if you compare this object B, either a nation or an organization or a group of people like a tribe, for example, or even individuals. So what are these metrics? Is there one metric by means of which if we can say that on this measure, if organization A or country A is more than organization B, then we should be able to say A is better than B. So is there there's been a search for one such metric for which we could use to define goodness and compare based on that. Over a period of time, many concepts have been developed. Like for example, we have used the concept of excellence. At one point, there was a measure of excellence was used as a measure of goodness. A company which is more committed to excellence or which has a demonstrated capability of excellence, we could say is better than a company B which doesn't measure up to the same level. Or we went through various concepts like that, and in the process we looked at core competencies. Companies which stuck and delivered on their core competencies are better than organizations or companies which are not so good on that. And based on all of those thinking, which has evolved over a period of time, today it is generally accepted that in management terms, the measure of goodness to compare is competitiveness. So we will see that it's applicable at multiple levels. First, let us see what it is. How is this defined? One definition of competitiveness has been defined as a sustained record of success against open competition. When all other things being equal, as they say, level playing field, if an organization A has a better record of success in an open competition, any competitors can enter, anyone can leave based on their position in the environment or in the ecosystem. And if an organization A or a country A demonstrates a sustained record of success in such open competition, then it is said that that organization, that country, that person is more competitive than the other contenders in the field. There have been many other definitions too, but this probably is one which captures both a one-time value and a enduring value. That is, competitiveness is not something that happens at one point. It has to be sustained over a period of time. So it captures the time element quite nicely. And during this lecture, we study competitiveness as a framework. If we use it as a way, as I said, as a metric to measure goodness, it's not just made based on one single value. It's based on a framework of evaluation metrics which put together define what competitiveness means. And why is it important? Why is this competitiveness and a framework used to measure it? Why is it important? First and foremost, competitiveness is important for survival. All living beings compete. All of us compete for limited resources in nature. There are other rivals. For example, all the creatures in an ocean, if they are carnivorous, there could be mammals could be competing against fish. Fish could be competing against crustaceans. Crustaceans can be competing against reptiles. All of them will be competing for a limited amount of carnivorous food available in the ocean. And this is the basic essence of nature. So all of us, to survive, we need to compete. And more importantly, for evolution and growth, organisms which evolved over time have grown, have survived. They have survived and they have prospered. And organizations in a given condition, which if they have not evolved, they have perished over a period of time. So it's important for survival. More importantly, it's important for evolution and growth. And today the thinking is that competitiveness is the most meaningful measure of excellence between any two bodies or two entities. It's the more meaningful measure of excellence and growth. Growth can be there, growth may disappear. It can also be a relative thing. When all organizations are shrinking in size, one which is shrinking slowest, we could say, is surviving better. It's more competitive. So competitiveness actually is a better measure than growth, more than profitability. So as a measure of excellence, as a measure of goodness, it's generally believed, accepted, that this concept of competitiveness is the most meaningful measure and over a period of time. And what is the measure? How do we measure that? How do we measure competitiveness? The very concept of a framework provides various measures to cumulatively measure competitiveness. That's why we use a framework. There is no one single metric which says, okay, A is more competitive than B. Various management researchers have evolved a group of interrelated metrics which, when measured together, give us a picture of competitiveness. We'll say more and more of what it means as we go further. However, everybody agrees that if you want to find one single measure of competitiveness, it's defined as productivity. Anybody who is more productive than its rivals and other contenders is more competitive than others. And it has been defined in the most common accepted definition of productivity, dollars of production per hour of work at nominal dollars. Most of the frameworks use nominal dollars, that is without any purchasing power parity. Or sometimes we can use to normalize between domains. Productivity may mean different things in different fields. Somebody working in the field of producing steel may define productivity in terms of tons of steel per hour or per employee. Somebody in the field of software, say banking, especially banking back-end operations, BPO, what we call, they may measure productivity in terms of number of calls handled per unit of time, per hour. Somebody working in database BPO may define in terms of number of forms filled per hour. If we are talking about somebody working in agriculture, we may define productivity in terms of number of tons of yield of that crop or whatever that's being grown per acre of land or per hectare of land. So to make them be comparable on a common basis, most common measure used to measure productivity is in terms of dollars per hour. So many tons of steel per hour translates to so many dollars per hour. So many tons of wheat produced in a field converts into so many hours of dollars of per hour in terms of effort put in, and so on. So competitiveness is always measured as a framework, a group of related metrics. But one single most powerful metric ultimately is productivity, mostly measured in terms of nominal dollars per hour, is the most common accepted metric. And as I mentioned, there are many metrics based on the context, but the most commonly used metric is productivity in dollars per hour. And moving on, there are three dimensions of competitiveness. Let's take a look at that. Let me briefly go back. What does productivity or competitiveness mean? Those who were paying attention, you must have seen in my graphic that I have mentioned nation, organization, and an individual. So is competitiveness applicable to all three? The answer is yes. Nations can be competitive related to other nations. Companies and organizations can be competitive, are competitive regarding to other organizations in the same area, domain. And individuals, we can be competitive against our fellow individuals, fellow human beings, who are also contending for same resources. And how does this concept of productivity apply? Does it mean the same? How does it work? For example, two nations can be compared, for example, in terms of their GDP per capita. Per person, what's the annual GDP produced? For example, in the case of India, last year it was around $2,300 per head per year. Some other nation, for example, Vietnam, it would be $3,000 per hour, per year, per head. So then we would say Vietnam is more competitive than India, based solely on GDP per person, per capita GDP per year. At organizations, there are similar metrics. It could be measured in terms of profitability per person per employee, production per person per employee, converted into dollars. And any company which has better metrics in production per employee per year than in its rival, either in its field or in another field, we could say that company A is more competitive than other company because it produces more dollars of output per employee per hour than in its rivals. And same applies to individuals also. And the other question is, companies can become more competitive by adding more machinery, becoming more efficient. Likewise, nations, there are various techniques and tactics which have been recommended for nations to become more competitive. So as we as individuals can also become more competitive by moving between different fields or generating more output in a given field itself. To give an example, if I'm a farmer, if I have a pair of oxen, I probably can plow 5 acres per day. So my productivity, not converting into dollars, is 5 acres of plowing per day. Now, if my neighboring farmer buys a tractor by making an investment in technology, new technology, he is able to plow 50 acres per day. So, on a crude measure, we could say my neighbor is 10 times more productive than I am. And consequently, he'll be more competitive. He can plow more land, he can produce more. So, one person can generate more crops per year than me. With my pair of oxen, I can only do 5 acres per day. So, even at the level of individuals, this concept of productivity is applicable and can be measured along so many dimensions. So, this concept of competitiveness is applicable at all three levels: national level, company level, and individual level. Let me go back to the desktop. So, as I briefly covered, and they are all interrelated. You can see the arrows between them. If individuals are competitive, individuals within an organization, individuals within an ecosystem of an organization, that is, employees of a company or employees associated with the company. There could be their suppliers, there could be their vendors, their dealers in their ecosystem. If individuals in the ecosystem are all competitive, it influences the competitiveness of an organization. If employees are competitive, suppliers are competitive, vendors are competitive, and various distribution mechanisms an organization uses, a company uses, are competitive, it results in an organization which is more competitive than anybody else. The productivity of that organization will be higher than its contenders in the field. And if organizations in a nation are competitive, if they are more productive than organizations in other countries, then the nation itself will be more competitive compared to other nations, which in turn influences the competitiveness of the individuals. You could generally say a nation with a higher productivity, measured in terms of higher per capita GDP, enables its individuals to attain higher levels of productivity by being able to deploy higher incomes, to increase their skills, increase their tools, and what have you. Thus, competitiveness feeds on each other. More competitive individuals result in a more competitive organization. More competitive organization results in a more competitive nation, and it continues. So these are the three dimensions, and we will look at it in this framework in terms of competitiveness at each level. We look at competitiveness of nations, competitiveness of organizations, and competitiveness of individuals. Different frameworks have been developed to measure this concept of competitiveness, We will take a look at some of them at each dimension. Before that, let's briefly touch base in terms of defining what is a framework. As I've been saying, we are going to look at competitiveness as a framework to evaluate things, to measure things. So what is a framework? Or in other words, what's a conceptual framework? It's an analytical tool. As I said, competitiveness cannot be measured. Productivity is used as one measure, but it's not the only measure of competitiveness. We need to measure competitiveness as a set of related metrics. So these metrics together form an analytical tool to analyze the situation and come up with a conclusion. So, and that is called a conceptual framework. Conceptual framework is an analytical tool. It's a logical set of categories, classifications, dimensions, and so on to help organize concepts. Remember, concept competitiveness is a concept which needs to be measured. Parameterize them, put them in terms of metrics which can be measured, collect data, develop metrics about any subject or domain. A framework helps us to logically set of categories, classify them, define different dimensions. To measure why an automobile A is better than automobile B, we might develop a framework which will measure the size of the engine, the interior room capacity, how many people can it hold, what is the speed it can attain, what is the acceleration it provides, what is the fuel efficiency, what is the general comfort factor, and looks. So our framework includes these 6 or 7 dimensions and parameters. On that basis, we put some values on them and finally say car A is better than car B. Likewise, that's a framework. It's a framework which enables us to develop a concept. In the example I took the example of concept of comparing two cars on various measures. So a framework is an analytical tool which helps us develop form a logical set of categories, which in our case is competitiveness, classify them, define different dimensions, and collect data about various parameters, evaluate metrics about any subject or domain, which helps us conclude what is one is better than the other, or compare any two objects in the same domain. So a logical framework, as we have already seen, an analytical tool, it helps us with comparison. How do we compare two nations? By developing a framework of competitiveness, evaluating them, collecting data, measuring them, and thus comparing them. So it helps with comparison, evaluation, and decision making from among the entities and alternatives that populate the domain. Again, why do we compare? To help us make decisions. Suppose there is a metric of competitiveness between two nations. Let's say there are 3 nations, A, B, and C, and using our metric, we define that nation B is the most competitive, nation A is second most competitive, nation C is the least competitive among the 3. If I am heading a multinational corporation, if I have to decide in investing, opening a new factory in any one of these countries, a framework like competitiveness helps me decide where to invest. If I invest X amount of money in B, nation A or nation C, a framework like competitiveness helps me evaluate and decide and finally say, okay, it is best to invest in nation B. Or if B and A are very close to each other, I may want to say I want to invest 60% in B, 40% in A. So a conceptual framework is an analytical tool which helps us with comparison, evaluation, and decision making from among the entities and alternatives that populate the domain. Same thing with individuals. I have to hire one person out of 2. So I develop a framework to compare the 2, evaluate them, and finally decide whom to select, either person A or person B. That's in brief about a framework, an analytical framework. And we are going to see competitiveness as a framework throughout this session. And we keep hearing the term that productivity is a measure of competitiveness. Productivity normalized into dollars per hour is a commonly used measure of competitiveness today. While comparing two people, to organizations, or to nations, productivity in terms of dollars per hour is used, and that has a direct link with competitiveness. It is generally postulated that higher the productivity, more competitive the organization or a nation or what have you. And in this context, we also need to look at the role of innovation. what is the link between innovation, productivity, and competitiveness? In most of our management schools, we lay a lot of stress on innovation. Why is that? Because it turns out there's a close relationship between the three. Higher innovation drives productivity. Higher the innovation, it gives rise to higher productivity. Let's go back to the comparison between me as a farmer and my neighbor. When both of us had the same pair of oxen, we are equally productive. We could plow 5 acres a day. My neighbor came up with an innovation. He either invested money and bought a tractor. Between the two of us, that's an innovation. Or maybe he put a iron tip to his plow, which helped him plow deeper or faster. An innovation like tractor or a metallic plow helped my neighbor to either plow deeper or plow 50 acres per day. That innovation helped him gain over me in terms of productivity. I could do 5 acres, he can do 50 acres due to his innovation. He has become more productive, and that made him more competitive. Where I could generate enough crops on only 5 acres, he could generate higher yields on 25 acres per day or 50 acres per day. So that's how the link between innovation, productivity, and competitiveness. Innovation leads to higher productivity, which in turn leads to competitiveness. And as it happens many times, competitiveness gives enough risk capital. It generates enough extra capital, extra resources to put back into innovation, which in turn drives productivity, which in turn drives competitiveness. So we can see that the link between innovation, productivity, and competitiveness can be a virtuous cycle. Innovation drives productivity, which drives competitiveness, which in turn can drive higher innovation. That's the link between these three concepts. So having said that, let's look at competitiveness in terms of 3 dimensions. Let me just go back. So at this point, we have gotten a rough idea of what is competitiveness, why is it important, what are the measures which can be used to measure competitiveness. Competitiveness is a measure of goodness. What are the measures we can use, and what are the framework we can develop. Competitiveness is a concept which is very difficult to capture by one single number. So we need to use a framework to evaluate the concept of competitiveness. And we have seen competitiveness has 3 dimensions: national, organizational, and individual. Now let's take a look at various frameworks developed to measure competitiveness at all 3 levels. There are different frameworks to measure competitiveness at the national level, at the organizational level, at the individual level. Let's take a look at each one of them. Let me go back to my desktop. The first dimension of competitiveness we are going to look at is at a national level, national competitiveness. As it happens in management research, this is a very well studied concept. A lot of frameworks have been developed which measure different aspects of competitiveness, different dimensions of competitiveness itself at a national level. The most common and comprehensive framework which is available to us today is the Global Competitiveness Report developed by the World Economic Forum. This is what we will briefly look at. This is a framework which is very well laid out. We'll take a look at how it measures competitiveness as of nation. There is also the concept developed in his book by Professor Michael Porter of Harvard, which covers competitive advantages of nations. This measures competitiveness between nations in terms of how many competitive clusters they have in various industries in their country. And the World Bank measures another aspect of competitiveness between nations. It publishes the ease of doing business report. The general idea being nations where it's easier to do business turn out to be more competitive and more productive for a period of time. And then organization called Heritage Foundation produces an index of freedom, economic freedom, as a measure of competitiveness. Again, their thesis being nations which are economically more free also tend to be more productive and more competitive. And the World Intellectual Property Organization publishes Global Innovation Index. which nations are more innovative than others. In the previous slide, we have seen innovation on a general basis drives productivity, which in turn drives higher competitiveness. So there are a lot of frameworks to compare and contrast different nations and different aspects of competitiveness. We will in detail we'll take a look at one of them, the Global Competitive Report published by the World Economic Forum. And the World Economic Forum, this is their definition of competitiveness. We define competitiveness as the set of institutions, policies and factors that determine the level of productivity of an economy, which in turn sets the level of prosperity that the country can earn. Remember, at the national level, typically competitiveness and productivity are measured at per capita GDP. So a nation which is more productive will have a higher level of per capita GDP measured in nominal dollars per year per person, and higher the per capita GDP, more prosperous the nation is, more competitive the nation is, more prosperous its citizens are. They lead a more better life than perhaps citizens in a less competitive nation. So WEF defines competitiveness at 3 levels: as a set of institutions. We will see each one of them. What do they mean by that? Set of policies and factors that determine the level of productivity of an economy, which in turn sets the level of prosperity that the country can earn. There is another definition of competitiveness based on competitiveness of nations by Professor Michael Porter. He says, he defines competitiveness of a nation in terms of competitiveness of its companies and its clusters. Companies that have a sustained success in international market, in open markets, open competition, companies which have a sustained success in international market are competitive, and nations are competitive when companies are competitive. So companies are competitive when they have a sustained record of success in international market, when they have succeeded by sustained innovation leading to productivity gains, which have led to higher competitiveness of companies, and nations become competitive when companies within the nation are competitive in the international market. For the purpose of this lecture, we will stay with the World Economic Forum's concept, but be aware that there are other definitions of competitiveness at a national level. So the forum has changed a bit over a period of time. This is one sample framework that the World Economic Forum has defined. As they have said, there are metrics developed at the institutional level, at a policy level, and at the level of factors which affect the economy. And they have developed 12 pillars to measure competitiveness, 12 metrics to measure competitiveness across these 3 dimensions. And first pillar is institutions. How strong are the institutions? How strong is the governance? How strong are the courts? Are the enforcement mechanisms? How strong is the bureaucracy? So institutions mean one pillar is how strong. They have various metrics. For those who are detailed, this report is available in the public domain. You can download and take a look as to how they measure the value of institutions. They put a value on how strong the institutions are. Second is in terms of infrastructure. Road infrastructure, rail infrastructure, other modes of transportation, power availability, telecommunications availability. So they have developed evaluation measures to give one value for infrastructure. Higher the value, better the infrastructure. Macroeconomic environment, the policies of that nation. How easy it is to invest in that nation. How easy it is to wind up an investment and close if things are not going well. Fourth, health and primary education. Thinking being a healthier population and a better educated population is a strong factor in ensuring the prosperity of that nation, in ensuring the competitiveness of nation. A healthier population, better educated population makes for better employees, more productive employees and more innovative employees. So one more measure that this framework includes measures the health and primary education level of its population. So all these come under what are called basic requirements. A nation to be competitive should have high values across these 4 pillars. Then once these are in place, they have developed metrics which they say helps increase the efficiency of operations. It includes higher education and training. Basic education is needed by all employees. Higher education and training results in more productive employees, more innovative employees. What's the efficiency? It's not enough if we have transportation mechanisms. It's not enough if we have railways and roads. They should be more efficient. How efficient are the markets to move goods? How much goods can be transported over a period of time? How quickly can be transported? Labor market efficiency. What's the productivity of labor? We can put the latest in machinery. If the employees are not well trained, they will not be able to generate the adequate level of production. So labor market efficiency is defined in terms of, it's influenced by level of education and training, and it's measured as economic output per employee per unit of time. Financial market development. The more ways are there to finance an operation, it's how easily can companies raise capital. The more easily they can get more productive. So how sophisticated is the financial market? The more ways there are, the cheaper to raise capital, the cheaper it will be to raise capital, and consequently a company or any organization can become more productive if they have more efficient ways of raising financial capital. And technological readiness. How ready is this nation to leverage and use technology? Again, which goes back to dependence on higher education and health and primary education. We can bring in, import the latest tools, but if the employees are not ready to use them, if they are not trained, we are not technologically not ready to deploy those tools. But as we have seen, technology is a key input to innovation. So higher our technological readiness, more productive we will be and more competitive as a nation. And size of the market. So bigger the market, it leads to what is called economies of scale. So bigger the market, it's more attractive to develop products for that market, which will enable us to make those products cheaply, sell more products, and be more productive and competitive. And so these pillars, higher education, goods market efficiency, labor market efficiency, financial market development, technological readiness, market size, once the basic factors are in place, once a nation is competitive on the basic factors, then these factors, as it gets better, will make it even more productive. It moves from one level of productivity to the next level of productivity and next level of competitiveness. And the last level, when a nation is highly competitive on these two factors, the factors which drive the next level of competitiveness are business sophistication and innovation. This goes hand in hand. Innovation may be in terms of products, new and new products and new processes. Business sophistication may predominantly refers to how innovative are the companies in that, are the businesses in that country which can leverage these innovations. Oftentimes we hear that a product which was innovated didn't really make it to the market, it didn't become a success because no business model was developed. So this essentially refers to sophistication of the businesses in coming up with new business models to leverage the innovation which drives productivity. So they have defined 3 levels of productivity for nations and 3 factors which influence that. Nations at the lowest level of productivity are still lagging. They are still yet to improve on their basic requirements in terms of institutions, infrastructure, macroeconomic environment, health and primary. Institution also refers to political stability. If there are frequent elections or frequent changes of governments and policies, institutions are not strong. That is, policies made by one government do not sustain across multiple governments. When government change, policies change, that affects the level of productivity and level of innovation going on in that nation. So nations at the lowest level of competitiveness are still to reach their full potential across these 4 factors, and those nations are defined as factor-driven economies. Once nations are highly competitive on these factors, then they need to focus and become better on the second set of factors which WEF calls as efficiency enhancers. So as nations improve their values on these factors of efficiency enhancers, nations, WEF defines those nations as efficiency-driven nations. And once nations have met their basic requirements and are highly efficient and competent, then nations move into the next level of competitiveness, where their level of competitiveness depends upon the sophistication of their businesses and the level of innovation happening. And WEF classifies those nations as innovation-driven economies. To illustrate it with better examples, among all the nations defined, they use a measure of ultimately GDP per capita along with certain other factors. They refer to nations like India, Sri Lanka, Nigeria. Nations like that, we are still classified as factor-driven economies. And their prescription is to become more competitive, these nations have to strengthen their institutions, their infrastructure, their macroeconomic environment, making policies go across governments, and improve the health and primary education of its basic population. The WEF defines nations like China, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand as nations in the efficiency-driven stage. These nations have very high values for these basic factors. Now they need to focus and improve their values on higher education, making their goods market more efficient, making the labor market more efficient, financial markets more efficient, and increase the technological readiness of the market. And it classifies nations like the United States, much of Western European nations like Germany, France, Britain, Italy, Switzerland as innovation-driven economies. These nations have a very high level of basic infrastructure. They have a very high level of efficiency-driving infrastructure. For them, their prosperity depends upon their businesses being very sophisticated. They already are, and they are focusing heavily on innovation. They are very innovation-driven. That's how they have been put at the highest level of competitiveness. As we have seen, it may take a little time for this whole thing to sink in, but do think about it. There seems to be some interesting innate sense in that. Nations which are struggling with the basic health of its nation, basic education, are the least competitive. You can look at their export basket. They may consist of very raw materials or basic manufactured products. Companies, nations which have moved to the next level, their basic population is well educated, it's very healthy, they have basic infrastructure in place, their economic policies are fairly stable. Now they are able to produce goods with a very high level of efficiencies. Not necessarily new and new goods, but the goods that are made, they can make and sell at the cheapest cost across the world and capture market in those products. And the nations that have classified as efficiency-driven markets are all very competitive in that area. And nations which are innovation-driven, they are the nations which constantly, Japan also is included at this level, constantly coming up with new and new innovations, new businesses, new products and new business models, which drives their level of innovation. And WEF has a set of prescriptions for these nations, what they should focus upon. It's a set of prescriptions for these nations, what they should focus upon, and a set of prescriptions for these nations to increase the competitiveness of nations. So this is one framework. To measure competitiveness at a national level, there is one framework which is fairly detailed, which measures a lot of metrics and gives a framework to compare nations based on the values the nations attain on these metrics on that framework. That's the Global Competitiveness Report. The good news is, over the past few years, India has been consistently improving on the scale. Now from late 70s and 80s, out of about 140s, we have come down to a level of the 50s. We are among the 50, somewhere in the 50-55 most competitive nations in the world. So this is a good measure of thinking of competitiveness among nations, understanding that, and a measure to compare between two nations, which is more competitive than other nation. And they put up various graphics on various years. They don't remain the same, they change from year to year. In the year 2015 and 16, for comparison, according to the WEF report, the BRICS nations, how competitive in the global ranking. You take all these metrics, add them up, and come up with one single measure. According to that measure, among the BRICS economies in 2015 and 16, China was the most competitive nation, which is number 28 in the world. Russian Federation has moved, is at number 45. South Africa is at 49. India was at 55 and Brazil was at 75. We have improved a little more on this for a period of time. These two nations have regressed a little more. China roughly is where it is today, also around 25-28 ratio. Gives a comparison to compare competitiveness between nations within the BRICS group. China, Russia, South Africa, India and Brazil. This is a value in 1 year. We need to see the trend across years to form an opinion. But the good thing about this framework is that it's a data driven, it's metrics driven. It's not just a matter of opinions, matter of impressions. They have collected data from so many sources, collated them, analyzed them, and come up with values to help us comparison. Based on that, this is how these 5 nations stack up. And the objectives of this to help nations to focus on their strengths and weaknesses with very fine granularity. We're not just saying you're not competitive. We are going to tell you how competitive you are on various metrics also. For example, India, for example, our business sophistication is quite high. But our basic health and primary education is quite lagging. Our infrastructure is quite lagging. Goods market is quite lacking. Market size is quite big. So for every given nation, they're not just saying that you are number 55, but you are much higher on business sophistication. We are probably around 40 in innovation. Our overall ranking is 55, but we are number 40 in innovation. In certain factors, we are quite ahead, but in terms of infrastructure, we are worse than 55. We are number 60 or something like that. So it's fine-grained to help nations, to help tell nations what they should focus on. So in our case, we should focus on improving our physical infrastructure, making our power supply more dependent, telephone and broadband network availability more common, roads more better and smoother, railways more efficient, things like that. So objective is to focus on strengths and weaknesses with very high level of granularity, different measures, support it with data, highlight trends. It's being published continuously for more than 2 decades now. So looking at that, each nation's policymakers can see where we are improving and where we are lagging and focus upon those areas and serve as a decision making or planning tool. If we are consistently doing bad in primary education or health, it's a clear indication to that nation's policymakers to focus on that aspect to improve their competitiveness. So this is one framework to measure competitiveness across nations. And as I said, this is available in a public domain. Those interested can go to the WEF site and download and look at how nations compare, what are the factors, what factors they are doing better, what factors they are lagging behind. The next dimension of competitiveness is corporate competitiveness. Competitiveness between organizations or companies. Here, among some of the metrics that frameworks I have seen, the cluster approach by Professor Porter, Michael Porter from Harvard, is probably one good metric to evaluate competitiveness of organizations. And he puts a link between companies and nations, so it can also be taken as a measure of competitiveness of a nation. His thesis being that a nation which has more competitive companies, a nation is competitive when companies within that nation are competitive. And so that's a link between nation and corporation. And this framework has prescriptions at both levels. Though I am using it as a framework to measure competitiveness between companies, this thesis of competitiveness of nations from Professor Michael Porter gives prescriptions. What should nations do? What should companies do to increase their competitiveness? And again, competitiveness in this framework, the cluster approach to competitiveness, what I call as the cluster approach to competitiveness, it defines competitiveness in terms of productivity again, unit of output per input. So many dollars of production, so many tons of steel produced per hour or per amount of capital, things like that. And this thesis proposes that the goal of a nation is to produce a high standard of living for its citizens, which also the WEF framework also says that a nation, if it's more productive and more competitive, it ensures a higher level of prosperity for its citizens. And here also it is stated the same, that the goal of a nation, why should a nation become competitive? Because to produce a high standard of living for its citizens defined in terms of income, per capita income. And it recognizes, though the WEF gives one measure of competitiveness for a nation as a whole, this framework recognizes that all nations are not competitive in all fields. Certain nations are competitive in certain fields. For example, in India, we are quite competitive in service sectors, in software development, in business process optimization. So in certain sectors, we are very competitive. In production of goods, not so competitive. So not all nations are competitive in all sectors. Japan, for example, is highly competitive in small cars, small autos, which we are also getting competitive. India also has become very competitive in small autos and electronics. Japan is highly competitive in electronics. It's not so competitive in software, for example. It's not, whereas US is highly competitive in fast food. For example, think of any fast food chain today, invariably, whether it be McDonald's or KFC or uh, Taco Bell or Burger King, you think of any fast food chain, highly competitive companies invariably are from the US. The US is very highly competitive in fast food. US is highly competitive in entertainment. Think of movies. First name which comes to mind is Hollywood across all nations. Hollywood is an international market. Italy is competitive in footwear, but not so much in automobiles. France is highly competitive in wine, but not so competitive in textiles, for example, or steel. France is highly competitive in fashion. Switzerland is highly competitive in pharmaceuticals. So this framework from the competitiveness of nature, the cluster approach, recognizes that all nations are not competitive in every field. And this is the definition of competitiveness. Companies have a sustained success in international market. They succeed by sustained innovation leading to productivity gains. So how does this competitive advantage come from? The conventional thinking is at national level, competitiveness comes from lower labor costs, lower interest costs, lower exchange rates, and economies of scale. And those nations which exploit lower labor costs, we say China leverages its lower labor cost to produce goods cheaply. So the conventional thinking is nations become competitive by exploiting these advantages. And at company level, we become competitiveness by taking part in mergers, forming alliances with rivals, collaboration with other companies, forming partnerships, and taking government support where we are weak, taking subsidies. These are the measures by which this is the conventional thinking. However, this framework says we need to move from, these are all comparative advantages. We have an advantage in labor comparativeness over other nation. This thesis says we should move from comparative advantage to competitive advantage. We become more competitive when we focus on innovation. We generate more innovation. We come up with differentiated products. We attain global scale. These should be the measures rather than things like mergers, alliances, collaboration, and partnerships. And this also proposes that in a given cluster, it defines a cluster as a grouping of related industries in a geographic area. In that area, there are various factors which influence. It has defined 4 factors. I will not go into detail. It says factor conditions, demand conditions, related and supporting industries, firm strategy and structure. These 4 factors reinforce at various nations in various clusters, which result in higher competitiveness of companies in that cluster. And all these factors mutually reinforce the accentuated effect, work as a system. And the diamond effect significantly is accentuated by physical proximity. It says a cluster is formed in a geographic cluster. It has identified various sectors. For example, the wine cluster in Australia, the movie cluster in Hollywood. Movie studios are only one aspect of movie making. For example, animation companies need to be located there. Talent search companies which provide talent are located there. Companies which develop props, companies which provide travel. All these companies are located in one single section in Hollywood, one location in Hollywood. This close proximity provides all these reinforcing sectors which makes movie making in Hollywood highly efficient and productive. Same things we can see in, for example, Mumbai, in Bollywood. The talent agents, the prop providers, the capital providers, innovation companies, the movie studios and sets, they're all co-located in one location which forms a cluster of movies. Likewise, they have identified a wine cluster in Australia, wine cluster in France, a footwear cluster in Italy, and things like that. And in India, for example, there is a knitwear cluster in Tirupur. All the companies related to knitwear are focused in one area in Tirupur, which has made it world competitive. Tirupur exports its knitwear textiles across the world at very competitive prices, and they're all located. So this says certain clusters develop certain competitive strengths, they reinforce each other. Organizations which are located there and leverage these factors become more competitive and they compete successfully across the world. A nation becomes more competitive when it can develop more and more of these clusters, feeding its economy. So with this basic thesis in mind, as you can see, this is less data driven than the WF framework, but gives a way to identify the various factors which make a cluster competitive, and it based on that certain prescriptions follow in this framework. The first prescription is companies should focus on innovation. They should create pressure for innovation. We are in a cluster, and one of the things is if we are in a cluster, there is always pressure for innovation. My neighboring company may also be doing knitwear. I'm in Tirupur, I'm making knitwear, and my neighbor, to win a leg up on me, comes up with a certain innovation which helps them, which I'll copy. When I copy, some other neighbor gets inspired by that, they come up with a third innovation. So being in a cluster naturally creates pressure for innovation, and companies should encourage that. Companies should focus on innovation, they should create pressure for innovation. Second part is first of that. Use competitors for motivation. My neighbor has come up with a new design in knitwear. Naturally, it motivates me. I should be motivated, come up with my own designs, which hold their own value in the world. Improve domestic diamond factors. The various factors mentioned in this diamond cluster the nation should accentuate and should encourage companies to co-locate and compete with them. Establish early warning systems. We start a new project to innovate on something, come up with a new product. It may be possible that we spend too much time and effort before we discover that our effort is wasted. Our innovation is not resulting, this effort is not resulting in suitable innovation. So innovation should be encouraged, but if the innovation is not likely to yield results, we should establish warning systems to let us know early so that we fail early and get out of that. We should not get committed too much to one single product. So if the product fails, if that innovation fails, it can take down the whole company with it. So we should try a lot of things, and if it looks like not succeeding, get out of that. And cooperate selectively with rivals. In a cluster, all rivals are now located together, even otherwise. Cooperate selectively. We do not want to cooperate so closely that we give out our secrets. Our strength comes from being competitive with the rivals too, being out-innovating them, out-motivating them. But it cannot be at the cost of our health. So compete selectively with our rivals, and it prescribes selective globalization. Globalize where our factors are in our favor. If we are competitive in knitwear, globalize on that. We may not be competitive in silkware, we may not want to open it. Selective globalization is what this framework prescribes. And within a cluster, within a nation, it says deregulate competition. There should be no barriers to competition. New companies should be able to come because they are the ones who innovate and motivate others to innovate. So deregulate. There should be no barriers to competition so that established companies can snuff out, then come in the way of new. It should be easy for new companies, innovative companies to come into the market. These are the prescriptions at the company level. Some of these are to be done by the national governments. For example, deregulation of competition is a governmental activity, but it is done at the company level. It's done for companies if are there to make them more competitive. On top of it, the government itself should focus on factor creation. That is, for example, in Tirupur, availability of cotton is one of the key factors for knitwear. So increase the availability, make it easier to grow cotton in that region, import cotton into that region if necessary. Avoid intervention in factors in currency market. Certain nations are believed to make them more competitive by manipulating the currency. Avoid currency manipulation. Enforce product standards. This is key. And the international market, products don't meet the standards, or even if some companies meet and some companies don't, the entire industry or the country is likely to suffer. So enforce, make sure that product standards are maintained. It's important in every field, especially important in things like pharmaceuticals. Enforce antitrust and prevent monopolies and cartels. That goes back to previous one, deregulate competition. On the other side of it is prevent monopolies. Limit cooperation among rivals. Make sure that 2 or 3 companies don't bottle up all the market. They form a cartel and prevent other companies from entering. So limit cooperation among rivals. Promote investment and deregulate competition. These are things that only a national or a local government can do, regulatory authority. Some of these factors companies can do, some of these governments can do. These are the prescriptions of the cluster approach to competitiveness. It says nations are competitive when companies are competitive. clusters approach is the way to make companies more competitive, where all the companies related to one industry are located in one area. They compete with each other and they become productive and competitive over a period of time. To encourage competition, these are the prescriptions for companies. These are the prescriptions for government. And let's take a brief look at the third dimension of competitiveness, individual or competitiveness. This is the least researched management literature. There is a lot of literature on self-help genres. How do I improve myself? How do I focus on this, that and all? But they cannot be applied to everyone. Many of them are qualitative measures, so they're not too much literature. But one piece of literature which might be useful at an individual level comes from Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. This book is about globalization. It says that there have been 3 eras of globalization. In the first era of globalization, countries globalized between 1492 and 1800. In globalization 2.0, between 1800 and 2000, corporations became globalized. Multinational corporations came. In the first era, colonial countries they have established colonies. In second era, corporations became multinational corporations. It says in the third era, 2000 and onwards, individuals have become competitive. We have become globalized, so that we all know stories of individuals sitting in India and doing jobs for companies in the US. They are doing tutoring, they are doing software development, they are providing expertise in cases, they are filling taxes for people sitting in the United States, for people in Europe, in Britain. So we individuals have become globalized, which means that we are competing across the world for jobs, for our livelihood, for our careers. So we individuals need to become competitive. At the same time, there are a lot of pressures. These are some of the bad news that we can see in the world. We see that engineering students are not getting enough jobs, management students are not getting enough jobs, they're not well trained. Industry constantly complaining that we are not getting enough well trained young people to fill our jobs. We have jobs, but we don't have employees. Somebody investing 6 lakhs to get an engineering degree in a private school may be offered jobs paying as little as 10,000 a month. So a lot of things are happening. So the first part is, as jobs are getting globalized, we individuals are getting globalized, we are also getting open to competition across the world. We can compete for jobs across the world. Likewise, our jobs also are open for competition across the world. And something is happening which says that there are certain pressures happening. One of the things that's happening is productivity is increasing. In manufacturing, this is a table that in 1981-82, Tata Steel, employees of Tata Steel produced 12.5 tons per employee. In 2015-16, employees of Tata Steel, one employee, produced 20 times more steel. So as a result, Tata Steel is producing 10 million tons of steel instead of 1 million tons of steel with only 40,000 employees. In manufacturing, thanks to this growth in productivity, 20-fold growth in productivity, number of jobs in manufacturing in various sectors, even in software, for example. Earlier, it was used to believe that a manager can manage about 5 to 7 employees per head. But today, thanks to availability of better software and better tools, a manager can manage 250 employees. So we don't need as many managers in service sector also. So this productivity is increasing the number of jobs in traditional fields. And the third effect is superstars is getting bulk of the income. In various fields, the best jobs are going to the superstars, which I call as the Rajinikanth effect. That if the total cost of a movie is 100 crores, 30 crores goes as a salary for the hero only. We are seeing that also in various fields, that we need to be competitive and at the top of our game. The hero makes 30 crores per movie, the cine worker makes only 1,000 rupees per day. So various solutions are being considered at various levels. How to make sure that we generate enough jobs? How do we make sure that individuals have enough purchasing capacity when productivity gains are reducing the number of jobs available to us as individuals, and we are open to competition for jobs across the world? Various solutions are happening at different levels. What we can do as individuals to make ourselves more competitive? I need to become more competitive. So what does that mean? Friedman's suggestion in The World is Flat is I must become an untouchable. He defines an untouchable as a person whose job cannot be easily done by others. For example, we hear about somebody making pan in a given city in such a way that nobody else makes as good a pan as this gentleman. So his job is become untouchable. Nobody can make pan, replace him as easily. The solution for us to individuals is to focus on jobs and those sectors where our job becomes uniquely ours. Nobody else can touch. We need to be more productive and various things, but we also need to become. And what are those jobs? Friedman in his book defines various categories of those jobs whose jobs he considers are untouchables. Nobody else can do that job. For example, the example he gives is great explainers, great teachers. Everybody can teach out of a textbook, but people who can explain those concepts so that everybody else can understand. Why is Carl Sagan a better teacher than anybody else? Because he explains astronomy better than any other teachers. Those jobs cannot be easily outsourced. Those jobs cannot be easily taken away. So if our strength is an explanation, we should focus on being good explainers who do not necessarily teaching is one role. Explainers come in all fields. There are certain people who explain the business market, the stock market. They become analysts who come on TV and explain how to invest in stocks. Then there are he considers a category called math lovers. People who are so good in math, they can come up with new ways of trading stocks, new ways of manufacturing things, new ways of developing artificial intelligence. These jobs nobody can do. So those who are good should focus on these jobs. Math lovers are one category, which are untouchables. Then there are these passionate personalizers, he calls one category. The example I gave was Panwala. He sits in front of this big hotel somewhere, big restaurant. Nobody makes as good pan as he does. There may be somebody else who makes jalebis, which are so crispy nobody else can do. They personalize. They do something in a unique manner that nobody else can do. So focus on those jobs. People who sing, who dance in a particular fashion. There are so many YouTube stars today. They have become famous because they sing in certain fashion, which appeals to certain people. So this is one more category of jobs where we take a job, very mundane job of making pan, add our personal touch to that so that nobody else can do. So our job is not at risk and we become very competitive. If in software development or in processing, if somebody in other country can do it cheaper, if they can do 100 forms per day for $5, where I can do 100 forms per day for $10, they become more competitive and take away my job. But if I make pan in such a way that nobody else can do, if I create games in such a way that nobody else, if I can do animation, which nobody else can do, then we are not competing on price, we are competing on skills. Those skills will be personalization skills, math skills, great explanation skills, and people who can take various concepts and synthesize them. So he has identified about 8 categories. So this is one approach for us to become competitive. We can do what we are doing in a better, cheaper, faster way, but there is always somebody who can match those things. But he says by focusing on these different categories, our jobs become untouchable and we become competitive, irrespective of how globalized the world is going to be. New opportunities are coming up, productivity is increasing, but at our individual level, our job and our skills are always in demand. This is the third framework for competitiveness at an individual level. And of course, we can always become entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are people who come up with their ideas, their businesses, and generate value, generate their own businesses, generate revenue, generate value. And some of these trends, for example, the passionate personalizer. I do things in my own way. I do pan in my own way. I sing in my own way. I become an entrepreneur and start my own companies selling pan across the nation. So being entrepreneur probably is the wave of the future. But having said that, some of these trends of making our job, identifying what is our strength. Am I a great explainer? Am I a great personalizer? Am I a great adapter? Am I a math lover? Focusing and excelling on that one area, making my job, will make my job untouchable, which makes me very competitive across the world as an individual. So to sum up again, competitiveness is a measure of goodness. It's a measure of excellence. It's a way to compare two different entities in the same domain to to see who is better than the one, who is likely to survive and succeed today and into the future. It applies at the national level, at the corporate level, at individual level. There are so many metrics, productivity being one, but the best way to measure competitiveness in terms of developing a framework, a set of metrics, related metrics to compare and contrast and come up with prescriptions to make more competitive. There are many metrics, many frameworks at the national level to compare nations. One we looked at is the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report. There is a set of prescriptions come out of that report. At the corporate level, there is the Porter's the cluster approach to competitiveness. Though it was developed for nations, it's also equally applicable for companies. It has a set of prescriptions for companies to become more competitiveness, set of prescriptions for governments and authorities to make companies more competitive. And at the individual level, there is this framework of making your job untouchable. Today in this era of globalization, where individuals are globalized, we compete, others compete with us. The way we become competitive is by leveraging our individual strengths, understanding our individual strengths, and focusing on one of those areas which makes us, our jobs, untouchable in a new concept. It's not untouchable in the traditional sense we use in India. It's in terms of my job and my skills cannot be touched by anyone else. If I have a job here, nobody can take away my job. In that sense, I am untouchable. So these are the three ways, and we have seen competitiveness is important because it's essential for survival, it's essential for growth and evolution over a period of time. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. As always, I encourage all of you to go out and look at some of the literature which is available in this field to increase your understanding about the idea of competitiveness. Once again, thank you.